They were born from silence and pain, children who carried on their faces the forbidden mixture between the master and the enslaved woman. Children who, many times, had no name, no rights, no future. While official history kept silent, in the slave quarters the truth echoed. Each baby was living proof of a cruel system that turned bodies into merchandise and lives into secrets. Today, we will reveal who the children of silence were. Babies forgotten by history, but who carry within themselves scars that still shape our society. To understand who the so-called children of silence were, we need to go back to the beginning, to the heart of the slave system, where every relation of power was marked by absolute inequality. The body of the enslaved black woman did not belong to her. It was seen as the property of the master, part of the inheritance, a possession that could be used, rented, or sold. This perverse logic turned the woman's existence into a territory of domination, where her humanity was denied daily. The slave quarters, much more than just a physical space, became the silent stage of abuses that were rarely written in books, but that shaped entire generations. Slavery in Brazil was one of the longest and cruelest in the world, extending for more than 3 centuries. In this period, the logic that sustained the system was clear. The enslaved person was reduced to merchandise. However, in the case of women, this condition became even more devastating because beyond labor exploitation, there was sexual exploitation, which turned into an almost naturalized practice. The master had absolute power not only over economic destiny, but also over the intimacy and body of those who lived under his domination. The daily life of an enslaved woman was marked by double or even triple work shifts. Working in sugarcane fields, in mills, or in the big houses, they carried on their bodies the exhaustion of endless tasks. But at nightfall, when the work routine seemed to end, the true terror often began. The master, protected by the silence of the early hours, walked through the corridors of the big house or descended to the slave quarters. There, with no witnesses able to oppose him, he imposed his will, and the female body was turned into an extension of his authority. It is important to understand that there was no legal protection for these women. The law was always on the master's side. If a black woman dared to accuse or denounce, her voice would be suffocated by the weight of racial prejudice and legal inequality. Rape, which should have been considered a heinous crime, was treated as something non-existent when it came to enslaved women. After all, in the eyes of colonial society, how could a property suffer violence? This dehumanization legitimized an endless chain of abuses. The slave quarters, often romanticized in certain versions of history, were an environment of constant surveillance. Even though it was the only space for rest, it was also marked by fear. There, women spoke in whispers, warning each other about the dangers of the night. It was common for older mothers to try to protect the young ones, hiding them or placing improvised barriers. But the truth is that against the will of the master, almost nothing could be done. The body of the enslaved woman became an invaded territory, a space where dignity was crushed by silence. Within this context emerged the notion of the master's right, a cruel idea deeply rooted in the slave-owning mentality. If the master had the power to decide over the life and death of the enslaved, why would he not also have the right to dispose of their bodies? This thought, besides justifying the abuses, made many believe it was natural for mixed-race children to be born from this process. However, these children were never recognized as legitimate. They carried on their skin, and in their blood, the proof of a violent society preferred not to see. It is also necessary to highlight how the female body became a double commodity, not only for labor and sexual exploitation, but also for what it represented in terms of reproduction. Enslaved women who became pregnant, even when as a result of violence, guaranteed more labor for the future. Many times, children born from these forced relations were enslaved from birth, increasing the master's property. This perverse cycle perpetuated the logic of domination and expanded suffering from generation to generation. However, behind every statistic, there was a flesh and blood woman. A young woman torn from Africa, or a descendant already born in Brazil, who carried on her back the weight of the plantation and in her soul the invisible marks of pain. Many of these women found subtle forms of resistance, prayers in African languages, hidden amulets, murmured chants asking for spiritual protection. These gestures, even if small, represented a silent cry against oppression. The body of the enslaved woman, therefore, was not only a space of submission, but also of resistance. Each contained tear, each attempt to protect a daughter or to hide an unwanted pregnancy was part of an invisible struggle, a struggle against a system that offered them no escape, but that paradoxically left deep marks that history could never erase. Closing this first chapter, we understand that the slave system was not only an economic regime, it was also a machine of dehumanization, which used the female body as a field of total exploitation. From here, in the next chapter, we will dive even deeper into this reality, to reveal how this constant violence turned into a silenced but devastating practice that marked enslaved women forever. If in the first chapter we saw how the body of the enslaved woman was turned into a territory of domination, in this second we dive into what history tried to hide: systematic sexual violence. It was not an isolated occurrence, but part of the mechanism that sustained the master's power. Rape was not recorded, it left no official documents, but it was present in the muffled corners of the slave quarters, in oral accounts, in hidden tears. The violence was so common that it became naturalized among the masters, but it never ceased to be an open wound in the lives of women. Silence was the cruelest weapon of this process. The women had no one to turn to. There was no law to defend them, no justice to give them voice. On the contrary, if they tried to resist, they were punished, often in public, to serve as an example. Silence was imposed by pain, by the whip, by the threat of even more violence. But it was also imposed by shame. How could they denounce something that society did not even consider a crime? The rape of an enslaved woman was seen as part of the natural order, as if it were just another right of the master over his property. That is why many abuses happened in the shadows of the night. The master waited for the silence of the big house, when everyone was already asleep, to go down to the slave quarters. Other times, the violence occurred in broad daylight, in a secluded room, in a corner of the plantation, before the helpless eyes of other enslaved people. No one could intervene. The absolute power of the master imposed itself like an iron decree. This atmosphere of fear made the slave quarters not only a place of forced rest, but also a space of constant terror. The consequences of this violence were devastating. Unwanted pregnancies, forced abortions, diseases, physical and emotional scars. Many women saw their bodies become prisons. Each time they were summoned to the big house, they knew they could return with invisible marks. Fear was passed from mother to daughter, because violence did not choose an age. Young girls, often teenagers, were already seen as targets, and their mothers did everything possible to hide them. Some shaved their heads, dirtied their clothes, or kept them out of sight, in a desperate attempt to protect a childhood that had barely begun. But the silence was not only individual, it turned into collective silence. Society knew, but pretended not to know. White women, the wives of the masters, often closed their eyes or even became accomplices, directing their anger not toward the abusive husband, but toward the enslaved women, who were accused of seducing or provoking. This perverse game reinforced the cycle of violence, isolating the victims even more, and ensuring that the truth remained hidden. The result of this forced silence was the normalization of violence. Over the course of centuries, slavery shaped a culture in which the black female body was seen as always available, as a space without rights. This mentality, deeply rooted, did not disappear with abolition. Even today, echoes of this dehumanization manifest in prejudice, fetishization, and stigmas that fall upon black women. Even so, the women were not merely passive victims. They found ways to resist, even in the midst of terror. Some organized support networks within the slave quarters, caring for one another, sharing home remedies to ease the pain. Others relied on spirituality, turning to African-based religions or Christian prayers, seeking strength in the invisible. Many carried amulets hidden under their clothes as symbols of protection against the malice of the masters. These gestures, though silent, were cries of survival. Sexual violence against enslaved women left no official records, but it left traces of blood, of pain, of children born from silence. Each mixed-race baby carried in their body the living proof of this violence, but these children were rarely recognized. They were hidden, treated as unwanted accidents, as inconvenient reminders that needed to be concealed from society. Silence, therefore, was not only about the violence itself, but also about its consequences. We close this chapter with a bitter reflection. The silence that surrounded sexual violence against enslaved women was not accidental, but a strategy of power. Keeping everything hidden was essential to preserve the image of the master, to protect the honor of white families, and to ensure that the machinery of slavery continued functioning without being questioned. However, this silence could not erase the pain. And in the next chapter we will see how from this silence lives were born, the so-called children of silence, children who carried in their bodies and souls the proof of the violence that history tried to conceal. From the silence of the slave quarters, from nights marked by fear and violence, lives emerged, babies who were not the result of love but of imposition, of pain, and of power. They were mixed-race children, carrying on their faces and skin the proof of a truth that society tried to hide. The masters impregnated enslaved women, but never recognized their children. These little ones were often called in secret children of silence. Silence because no one dared to speak openly about them. Silence because their existence was too uncomfortable for those who wanted to keep intact the image of a civilized society. When these babies were born, reactions varied according to the master's convenience. Some were tolerated in the slave quarters, growing up alongside the other children of enslaved women. Others, however, were taken closer to the big house, not as members of the family, but as potential servants. It was a way to keep close watch on those who, even without recognition, carried the master's blood. Still, most of these children were marked by rejection. For the masters, they were living reminders of an act they preferred to keep hidden. For the white wives, they were affronts to their honor. For the enslaved women themselves, they were beloved children, but also the fruits of violence they never chose to endure. Miscegenation in Brazil was born largely from this process of violence and silencing. Contrary to how history often romanticized it, the mixture of races was not, for the most part, the result of consensual encounters, but of systematic rapes. These children carried lighter skin or different features, and because of this, they became the targets of curious looks, of whispers, of stigmas. They did not fully belong anywhere. They were too different to be accepted among whites, but also, in some cases, treated with suspicion among the enslaved themselves, as they were seen as marks of oppression. Many of these babies did not even have a proper name recorded. They were noted in the books as child of such enslaved woman, with no right to paternity. Others received generic names or nicknames that followed them throughout life. This denial of identity was a second violence. If they were already born, carrying the weight of rejection, they were also deprived of the most basic right to be recognized as individuals. The living conditions of these children varied greatly. Some, when they demonstrated useful skills, were employed in tasks closer to the big house, helping with domestic services, learning trades, or even serving as companions for the master's legitimate children. But this did not mean protection. On the contrary, these children were constantly reminded that they were not equals. They grew up under the shadow of humiliation, treated as second-class servants, even with the same blood running through their veins. Others, less convenient, were simply left in the slave quarters, growing amid hunger, disease, and the infant mortality that decimated thousands of enslaved children. For many masters, these babies were nothing more than another replacement piece in the system. If they survived, they would become laboring arms. If they died, they would be just another invisible number, erased without record. But amid rejection and abandonment, there were also stories of affection. Many mothers, despite the pain of knowing their children were born of violence, gave themselves body and soul to protect them. They breastfed, hid, cared for, prayed. The maternal bond was often the only space of love these children could experience. For the women, these children were at once reminders of violence and motives for resistance. Raising them was an act of courage, a way of confronting the imposed silence. Society, however, preferred to ignore their existence. Official documents rarely mentioned these children. When they did appear, it was in discreet notes in inventories or wills, almost always described as illegitimate or mixed race. The history written by the victors chose to remain silent, but popular memory preserved the whispers about these children who were never able to be recognized. It is crucial to understand that the children of silence were not exceptions. They were numerous, spread throughout the entire Brazilian territory for centuries. Their presence was so significant that it helped shape the very identity of the country, making miscegenation a characteristic trait of the population. But this miscegenation was born from violence, from non-consent, from erasure. This is a point that the official narrative often tried to soften, but that cannot be forgotten. When we observe these stories, we realize that each one of these children carried a deep mark, that of not belonging completely anywhere. Children of masters who denied them, born from women who were forced, living symbols of a wound that history tried to heal without ever cleansing. They are the concrete proof that silence does not erase the truth, it only pushes it to the margins. Closing this chapter, we arrive at a painful understanding. The children of silence were not only victims of the individual abandonment of their fathers, but also victims of a collective project of forgetting. They were uncomfortable proofs that violence was part of daily life, and that is why they had to be hidden. But as we will see in the next chapter, even silenced, these children had destinies that reveal even more of the cruelty of the system. Some were raised in the big house, others relegated to the slave quarters, and many did not even survive the first year of life. The so-called children of silence grew up divided between two worlds that never truly met in a fair way. On one side, the big house, a space of privileges, abundance and power. On the other, the slave quarters, a territory of misery, pain and survival. Some of these mixed-race children were taken closer to the white family, raised under the vigilance of the mistress or assigned to small domestic tasks. Others remained in the slave quarters, mingling with the other enslaved, carrying on their bodies the mark of rejection. Between the two spaces, none of these children ever truly found a place of belonging. When the master decided to keep these children nearby, he did not do so out of affection, but out of convenience. Many were seen as future labor, raised from an early age inside the big house to serve, learn trades, or even become trusted servants. They received slightly better clothing, learned to speak the Portuguese of the elite, and lived alongside the master's legitimate children. But the difference was clear. Even inside the big house, they were never treated as equals. They were constantly reminded of their origin, called bastards or mixed race, words that carried contempt and reinforced their exclusion. The situation within the slave quarters was no less painful. There, these children shared space with blood siblings and with children who shared the same condition of being enslaved. However, their lighter skin or different features often placed them in an ambiguous position. Some were seen as privileged, arousing suspicion among the others. Others were treated with the same rigor of slavery, reminded at every moment that despite the blood they carried, their life had no more value than that of any other enslaved person. This place, between worlds, created a childhood marked by contradictions. While in the big house they learned rules of etiquette and lived with the masters, in the slave quarters they knew the harshness of life, the lack of food, and corporal punishment. Many of these children lived like shadows, moving between two spaces, but without the right to truly belong to either of them. They grew up learning to keep silent, to disguise their pain, to adapt to each environment as a form of survival. White women, the wives of the masters, played an important role in this scenario. Some, driven by anger and humiliation, saw in these children the living proof of their husband's infidelity. In many cases, they directed their fury directly at the enslaved women and their children. It was not uncommon for these children to be targets of aggression, public humiliation, or even banishment from the big house, as a way of erasing the discomfort they represented. To maintain social appearances, it was easier to expel or relegate these lives to the slave quarters than to admit the truth. But there were also cases in which the mistresses saw in these children an opportunity for control. Some raised them closely, not out of affection but to reaffirm their authority. It was as if, by shaping these children, they could transform the pain of betrayal into proof of power. These children were educated to serve, to grow under the vigilant eye of the big house, and to never forget that they were there by concession, not by right. Miscegenation in this context became a mirror of the contradictions of the slave system. On one hand, Brazilian society was formed from this mixture of races and cultures. On the other, it constantly denied the legitimacy of these lives. The children born from silence were invisible in family records, but omnipresent in daily life, reminding everyone that sexual violence was a structural part of slavery. Even so, some of these children managed to access small gaps of opportunity. By being closer to the big house, they learned to read, write, or practice trades that could give them some prominence. Some in the future even managed to obtain small freedoms or positions of relative respect within society. However, even in these cases, the stigma never disappeared. They were always children of an enslaved woman, always reminded that their origin was tied to silence and pain. For the majority, however, the destiny was different: to remain invisible, to grow under the shadow of the slave quarters, to live with hunger and punishments. Many did not even survive the first years of life, victims of infant mortality that devastated enslaved children. Those who endured faced a childhood without rights, without protection, with a future already dictated by the system. This contrast between the big house and the slave quarters cruelly shows how slavery shaped lives from birth. There was no space for innocence. From an early age, these children learned that their existence was uncomfortable, that they had to live in silence, that their place in the world was precarious. The very nickname, Children of Silence, carried within it the truth of their condition. They were born from what could not be spoken aloud. They grew up in a space that could not be officially recognized. They lived between worlds that rejected them equally. Closing this chapter, we see that these mixed-race children not only symbolize the forced encounter between two universes, but also the impossibility of full belonging. By living between the big house and the slave quarters, they grew up marked by contradiction. They were the master's blood, but not his children. They were blood siblings of the legitimate ones, but they would never be equals. In the next chapter, we will dive even deeper into the fate of these children, revealing how many were condemned to abandonment, to early death, or to total invisibility, becoming the true ghosts of a history that society preferred to erase. The destiny of the so-called children of silence was rarely written on paper, but it was engraved in the shadows of history. These children, born from violence and silence, faced a life already marked by rejection from the cradle. For the majority, the future was one of pain, abandonment, and early death. Even if some found a place close to the big house, the rule was forgetting. And in this forgetting, many were lost without leaving a trace, as if they had never existed. Infant mortality among enslaved children was brutal. Without access to medical care, with poor nutrition, and living in unsanitary environments, many did not survive the first year of life. Breast milk was sometimes the only source of nourishment, but even this care could be interrupted by the mother's work overload. In some cases, enslaved women were forced to breastfeed the children of the big house, leaving their own in a state of malnutrition. Thus, the lives of many of these babies were extinguished before even blooming. Beyond neglect, there were also cases of intentional abandonment. Some masters saw these mixed-race children as shame, as stains on their reputation. To preserve the image of honor before society, they ordered them to be left to their own fate. Historians report cases of children given to charitable institutions, such as foundling wheels, where babies were anonymously deposited. Others were simply left to die, hidden like uncomfortable secrets that could not come to light. Among those who survived, few had a childhood worthy of being called such. Many were destined from an early age to forced labor. At only 7 or 8 years old, they were already put to help in the plantations, carry water, take care of animals. Their condition as children of the master did not guarantee them privilege, but rather doubled vigilance. They grew up reminded that they were different, but that this difference did not mean acceptance, only servitude. There are reports of mixed-race children who, because of their lighter skin, were sold at higher prices in slave markets. They were seen as exotic, different, almost like rare merchandise. This cruel commercialization shows how even the pain of sexual violence was transformed into profit within the slave system. The woman's body was exploited, and the children resulting from that exploitation became new pieces of negotiation, an endless cycle of dehumanization. But not all of these destinies were only of pain and invisibility. In some rare cases, certain children were partially recognized by their master fathers, not officially, but in practice. They received opportunities to learn to read, to write, or were assigned to lighter functions within the structure of the plantation. These cases, however, were exceptions that only reinforced the rule of rejection. Even when they received a little more care, they were never treated as heirs, but rather as tolerated dependents. It is also important to remember that these children did not suffer only from the abandonment of their white fathers. They also suffered from the hostility of the legitimate wives, and in some cases, even from the mistrust of other enslaved people. They were in an intermediate, uncomfortable position that aroused resentment from all sides. For white women, they were the living proof of their husband's betrayal. For the enslaved, they could be seen as possible favorites of the master. This ambiguity caused many to live isolated, without belonging to any group. The absence of paternal recognition also deeply marked the identity of these children. They grew up without a surname, without lineage, without family history. In the society of the time, in which the name carried honor and social position, this absence was a condemnation. Without the recognition of the father, they had no inheritance, no rights, no voice. They were shadows, uncomfortable presences that everyone preferred to forget. Many of these children ended up disappearing into the cold numbers of inventories and wills. They appeared only as offspring of enslaved women, listed among the assets, without any distinction of origin. A visual history, written by the masters, chose to erase their faces, their voices, their destinies. But popular memory preserved echoes of their existence in songs, in stories passed down from generation to generation, in whispers that resisted time. Closing this chapter, we see that the destiny of many of these children was not only abandonment, but their transformation into social ghosts. They lived without a name, without rights, without belonging, as if they were not worthy of existing. This invisibility was not the result of chance, but of a conscious choice by society, which preferred to erase the evidence of its own cruelty. In the next chapter, we will shift the focus to those who fought against this forgetting, the mothers. Women who, even crushed by pain, found strength to resist and protect their children, turning maternal love into an act of rebellion against silence. Amid the silence of the slave quarters and the weight of social rejection, there was a sound that could not be completely silenced: the voice of the mothers. The enslaved women, who carried on their bodies the marks of violence, also carried in their hearts the determination to protect their children. These babies, born of pain, were equally fruits of love and resistance. For many, raising them was more than an obligation. It was a silent act of rebellion against the system that tried to dehumanize them. The mothers knew that their children would hardly be recognized. They knew that society would treat them as shadows, that the big house would see them as inconveniences, that the slave quarters would receive them with ambiguities. But even so, they fought for their survival. They made from the little food they had a sharing, dividing scraps of manioc, beans or corn, so that the children would not succumb to hunger. They breastfed even when their bodies were exhausted, turning milk into an act of resistance, an attempt to keep alive a life the world wanted to erase. The protection of these mothers often took creative forms. Some hid their children in the darkest corners of the slave quarters when the master approached, fearing they would be taken. Others improvised clothes or adornments so they would not attract the attention of the big house. There were mothers who told stories at night, using words in African languages to lull their little ones to sleep, preserving ancestral memories that slavery tried to erase. Each gesture, no matter how small, was a way of saying, "My child exists, he is more than an object, he is mine." The voice of the mothers also manifested in prayers. Many clung to the African beliefs brought from their peoples of origin, invoking orishas, protective spirits, invisible forces that could care for their children when they could not. Others, already influenced by the imposed Catholicism, prayed silently, asking the Virgin Mary or Catholic saints for the strength for their children to survive. This mixture of faith was, at the same time, an attempt to resist spiritually and a way of giving meaning to the suffering they endured. Even in the face of so much pain, there was a paradox. The children born of violence were also, for many women, sources of hope. Although they knew that the children carried on their bodies the mark of rape, they also recognized in them the possibility of a life that could be different. There were mothers who dreamed of seeing their children learning to read, conquering some space in society, breaking the cycle of slavery. To nourish that dream, even if distant, was a way of keeping the flame of hope alive. But we cannot romanticize this maternal love. It was constantly crossed by fear. With each illness, each punishment, each threat, these mothers feared losing their children. Many times they had to watch helplessly the consequences of rejection and abandonment. Some saw their children being sold, torn from their arms forever. Others were punished for trying to protect too much, accused of defying the established order. Love, in this context, was also a source of suffering, for it was always on the edge of loss. Even so, this love resisted, and in many cases, it turned into narrative. It was the mothers who passed down stories, lullabies, memories of their children and their communities. It was they who kept names, who remembered events, who kept alive the identity that the system wanted to erase. The silence of official history was not total only because, in the nights of the slave quarters, the mothers kept speaking. They spoke to their children. They spoke among themselves. They spoke in chants and prayers. This maternal voice was the invisible thread that resisted erasure. Many of these women knew they would not live to see freedom, but even so, they instructed their children to resist. They taught small strategies of survival, how to endure punishments, how to avoid the master's anger, how to hide feelings in order not to be punished. This knowledge, transmitted from mother to child, was a form of inheritance, a legacy of resistance that was passed forward with each generation. Closing this chapter, we realize that if the children of silence survived amid so many adversities, it was because they had mothers who refused to let them disappear. These women, even though crushed by violence, found in maternal love a strength capable of defying the system. It was they who gave voice to silence, who turned pain into care, who turned rejection into protection. In the next chapter, we will see how, despite this resistance, official history chose to erase the existence of these children and their mothers, creating a void that we still try to fill today. If the children of silence were born of pain and survived thanks to the love of their mothers, official history took care to erase their existence. The destiny of these children was not only physical abandonment, but also collective forgetting, carefully built by the masters and by slave-holding society. Silence, which began in the cradle, extended into books, documents, and official memories. It was as if these lives were unwanted twice, first in the womb, then in history. The records of the time reveal this erasure. In inventories, these children appeared only as offspring of enslaved women, listed among animals, tools, and other assets. Their names were rarely mentioned, and when they did appear, they were described in a generic way, without surnames, without identity. The paternal blood, which could have given them recognition, was systematically denied. The master could be the biological father, but would never be the legal father. The writing of the time turned lives into numbers, children into property, identities into merchandise. This silence was not accidental, but intentional. To recognize these children would mean exposing the practice of systematic rapes, revealing the hypocrisy of a society that called itself Christian and moral, but sustained its structure on violence. It would mean admitting that the big house was not only a space of power, but also of transgression. It would mean putting at risk the image of masters as honorable men. That is why historical erasure became an essential strategy. It was easier to pretend that these children did not exist than to face the truth they carried in their bodies. Silence was also reinforced by social taboo. White women, the wives of the masters, would hardly accept living with illegitimate children who denounced their husbands' betrayals. The white elite families preferred not to mention these matters, treating them as unmentionable secrets. Thus, the whole society organized itself around a conspiracy of silence. Everyone knew, but no one said. Everyone saw, but no one wrote. The truth became invisible, as if it could be erased by the simple act of not being recorded. Yet this erasure could not be total. Popular memory resisted. In the songs of the slave quarters, in the stories told from generation to generation, the children of silence continued to exist. What the books hid, orality preserved. Mothers, grandmothers, and black communities kept alive the memory of these children, speaking of them in whispers. recalling their names, singing their stories. This underground memory became the only way to confront the forgetting imposed by the elite. Historical erasure also had deep consequences on collective identity. Without recognition, these children grew up without a surname, without lineage, without belonging. This absence of record reinforced stigma and fed structural racism. It was as if official silence had laid the foundation for the fact that centuries later, descendants of these children still carry the mark of exclusion. The absence of documents, of names, and of stories contributed to the social invisibility that still affects millions of black people today. Brazilian miscegenation, often celebrated as a cultural trait, is, in large part, the fruit of this silenced violence. However, official discourses preferred to romanticize this mixture, presenting it as proof of a peaceful coexistence between races. This narrative, built over time, hid the traumatic roots of miscegenation, denying the rape, the silence, and the pain that originated it. It was a strategy of memory manipulation, turning tragedy into myth, violence into harmony. This mechanism of erasure continued until abolition and beyond it. Even after 1888, many descendants of the children of silence remained invisible in official records, living without access to land, education, or full citizenship. The republic that followed slavery did not rewrite the history of these children. It only perpetuated their exclusion. Silence crossed the centuries, becoming a heavy inheritance that we still seek to break today. Closing this chapter, we realize that silence was not just a detail of slavery, but a fundamental gear for its maintenance. By erasing the children of silence from history, society also tried to erase its responsibility for their pain. However, as we will see in the next chapter, this erasure could not eliminate the marks left behind. On the contrary, they perpetuated themselves as an inheritance of pain, transmitted from generation to generation, shaping the identity and destiny of millions of descendants. The silence that erased the mixed-race children of the past did not remain trapped in the centuries of slavery. It crossed generations, impregnating itself in the identity of their descendants, shaping memories and leaving open wounds that still influence Brazilian society today. The inheritance of these children of silence was not only biological, it was also psychological, cultural, and social. An inheritance made of rejection, of invisibility, and of pain. The collective trauma begins with the denial of paternity. For centuries, thousands of children grew up without a name, without a surname, without paternal recognition. This absence of filiation generated a sense of emptiness that was transmitted across generations. Many descendants of enslaved women still carry to this day the difficulty of reconstructing their origins, of knowing who their ancestors were, of understanding their own family history. The lack of documents, the erasure in records, the absence of written memory turned into gaps that could never be filled. This silence also produced a profound psychological burden. Growing up in a world that denied their existence made these children internalize the idea that they were unwanted. This invisible mark, transmitted from mother to child, perpetuated a feeling of inferiority, of exclusion, of not belonging. Even today, structural racism reinforces this heritage, reminding descendants daily that, in many spaces, they are still seen as foreign bodies, misplaced, out of place. Brazilian miscegenation, so often celebrated as a symbol of national identity, hides in its roots sexual violence and imposed silence. The heritage of pain lies precisely in this contrast. The entire country was shaped by this mixture, but rarely recognizes that it was born from oppression. Instead of confronting the truth, it was preferred to romanticize the harmony between races, erasing the violence that gave rise to thousands of lives. Thus the pain was perpetuated, disguised as myth, but always present in social inequalities. The structural racism that marks Brazil is, to a large extent, the fruit of this heritage. Rejected children in the past became marginalized descendants in the present. The exclusion that began in the slave quarters turned into exclusion in spaces of power, in politics, in economics, in education. The absence of historical recognition paved the way for the absence of social opportunities. It is as if the silence that suffocated the children of silence still echoes, determining who can or cannot occupy certain places. But this heritage is not only pain, it is also resistance. If the mothers of the past fought to preserve their children, the descendants of today fight to preserve memory. With each historical research, each testimony recovered, each work that reveals what was hidden, the silence is being broken. What was once shadow begins to become word. What was once secret begins to turn into collective consciousness. Black identity in Brazil was also shaped by this process. The struggle for affirmation, recognition, and equality was strengthened precisely by the need to break with historical erasure. By embracing their origins, by reclaiming the memory of those who were silenced, descendants of these women and children turned pain into strength, trauma into struggle, silence into voice. This reconstruction of identity is a political act, a gesture of collective healing. It is true that silence still persists in many areas. Schools, for a long time, did not tell these stories. History books preferred to speak of slavery as an economic process, without showing the human marks it left behind. But little by little, silence begins to be confronted. Researchers, writers, social movements, and artists are rescuing these memories, bringing to the present what the past tried to erase. This new narrative not only honors the children of silence, but also strengthens the generations that inherited their pain. Closing this chapter, we understand that the heritage of the children of silence lies not only in statistics or absent documents, but in the flesh and soul of a people who still today fight to be fully recognized. Silence condemned them, but could not destroy them. They left descendants, they left marks, they left stories that resist. And in the next chapter, we will see how the process of revealing these stories became a weapon against forgetting, a way to break once and for all with the silence that sustained centuries of injustice. For centuries, official history tried to erase the children of silence. But like all truth, no matter how much it is suffocated, it always finds a way to emerge. Today, more and more researchers, writers, and social movements are bringing to light what was hidden. What was once kept in the corners of popular memory, in dusty archives, in forgotten testimonies, begins to gain voice, body, and recognition. The silence that sustained slavery is no longer enough to stifle the cry of truth. This process of revelation began, in large part, through the work of historians committed to giving visibility to what had been erased. By combing through inventories, letters, wills, and parish records, they found traces of the mixed-race children that society preferred to ignore. Small notes, scribbled names, hidden mentions among economic documents revealed that, behind the coldness of the papers, there were entire lives rendered invisible. Each line found functioned like a silent scream that, finally, could be heard. But it was not only in the archives that these stories survived. In Black communities, orality played an essential role. Grandmothers told grandchildren, mothers passed stories to daughters, memories were kept in songs, proverbs, and narratives that resisted time. This oral heritage, often disregarded by academia, proves today to be one of the richest sources to reconstruct the history of the children of silence. What was not written in books was preserved in the living memory of a people who refused to forget. The recovery of these stories also happens in the arts. Writers, filmmakers, musicians, and visual artists transform into poetry, images, and songs the pain that official history tried to silence. Each work that portrays the mixed-race children of slavery is more than an artistic manifestation. It is a political act, a gesture of reparation. These narratives touch the public, break taboos, and show that we cannot build a future without facing the ghosts of the past. Revealing what was hidden is not just about telling old stories, but about understanding how these marks remain alive. The children of silence are not only characters of a distant time, they are the direct ancestors of millions of Brazilians. Each descendant who today seeks their roots, who tries to reconstruct their family tree, who reclaims their identity, is confronting historical silence. The act of recognizing oneself as heir to these stories is in itself an act of resistance. This process of revelation also helps to deconstruct myths. For a long time, Brazil cultivated the idea that its miscegenation was the fruit of harmony between races. Today, we know that this harmony was, to a large extent, an invention, constructed to disguise violence. By revealing the true origin of many of these children, the farce of peaceful coexistence is unmasked, and the brutality of the system is made evident. This deconstruction is painful, but necessary, so that society can face its past without masks. The recovery of the memory of the children of silence also has a transformative role in the present. When these stories are told, they open space for debates about structural racism, social inequality, and historical reparation. They show that today's exclusion is not the fruit of chance, but the direct result of centuries of violence and forgetting. Each time a researcher publishes a book, each time an artist portrays this theme, each time a descendant claims their history, a piece of silence is broken. However, revealing what was hidden is not an easy task. It faces resistance, generates unease, provokes discomfort. Many still prefer to believe in the romanticized version of history because the truth demands responsibility. To admit that the nation was formed upon systematic and silenced rapes is to recognize that violence lies at the very foundation of our identity. But precisely for this reason, revealing these stories is so important, because only by confronting the past can we transform it into learning and not into repetition. Closing this chapter, we understand that the revelation of the children of silence is an ongoing process. What was once shadow now begins to become light. History can no longer pretend they did not exist. And in the next and final chapter, we will see how breaking this silence definitively is not only an act of historical justice, but also a way to rebuild identities, restore dignities, and prepare a future in which no life will ever again need to be born condemned to forgetting. We have reached the end of this journey, and now silence can no longer be the same. The so-called children of silence were not merely forgotten characters of slavery. They were real lives marked by violence, abandonment, and rejection, but also by the resistance of mothers who refused to let their memories die. Each mixed-race child born between the slave quarters and the big house was living proof that the slave system was not sustained only by forced labor, but also by the systematic violation of bodies and identities. Throughout this narrative, we have seen how these children were ignored by records, rejected by fathers, used as labor, or discarded as inconveniences. We have seen how historical silence tried to erase them, turning their existence into cold notes in inventories or into unwanted memories. But we have also seen how the mothers fought for them, how communities preserved their memories, how love and resistance became weapons against forgetting. Breaking the silence today is an act of justice. It is recognizing that the history of Brazil cannot be told only from the perspective of the big house, but also from the slave quarters, from the violated bodies, from the silenced voices. It is admitting that Brazilian miscegenation was born, in large part, from pain and not from an invented harmony. And more importantly, it is understanding that this past remains alive in the present, reflected in structural racism, in social inequality, and in the exclusion of millions of descendants of these children. By bringing these stories to light, we give a name to what was once anonymous. We give a voice to what was once silence. We give dignity to what was once oblivion. This gesture does not return the lives lost, but it restores the humanity that was stolen. And in doing so, we open space so that the next generations may grow no longer in the shadow of silence, but in the light of truth. And you, who have followed until here, are part of this process. By listening, reflecting, and sharing this story, you become an agent of memory, someone who helps to break the pact of silence that sustained centuries of injustice. Silence protected the oppressors. The word frees the oppressed. That is why telling, remembering, and giving voice is so important. Silence tried to hide the children of silence, but they have always been here, alive in memory, present in the faces of their descendants, pulsing in the history that insists on revealing itself. May we, together, honor these lives, transforming pain into awareness, erasure into presence, silence into voice. If this story has touched you, if you believe that these memories can no longer be erased, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and share this video. The more people listen, the stronger will be the voice of those who are silenced, because history only transforms when we stop being spectators and become part of the change.